Have everybody here tonight. Thank you for being here, and thank you for making this Wednesday night a part of your week. Hope you're doing well. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, and then just two announcements, and we'll get into our Bible study. Father, thank you for tonight and the opportunity to be here, to study your word, and more importantly, through this study, to not just gather information, but to have our hearts and our minds transformed into the image of Christ as we are disciples of His. And that we want to work together, and that we want to seek the good of each other and the good of the community around us as Jesus did. We're thankful that you have saw fit to have His life written down so that we can study it at any time and we can read of the good and the great things that He did. We're thankful for that, and we're thankful for Christ. With the ultimate sacrifice which all the four Gospels funnel into, with His death on the cross for the entire world, His burial and His resurrection that gives us hope and that anchors us in this life and keeps us, even though we're tossed to and fro, it keeps us steady and calm, and we're thankful for the hope and the promise of the resurrection. We pray for your blessings on our class tonight, and it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Many of you are probably aware of Sister Louise Powell. She fell and has been having some health issues. She's been in the hospital. She'll be staying overnight tonight, and then if she continues to improve, she'll go to a rehab facility for a few weeks, and then she will be able to make it back home. So please keep her in your prayers. If you want more information, I'll be more than happy to share with you after class. And don't forget the time change on Sunday. So we get good weather and we get time change. So we get the hour. We lose that hour, gain that hour, however you'd like to look at it. But the sunshine stays out later. So that's a good way and a positive way to look at it. So don't forget your time change on Sunday. Again, I'm glad that you're here. Mark chapter 9 is where we are going to be. Mark chapter 9. Three things that I didn't share with you last week as we close out this section with as Jesus heals the boy with the spirit, with the demon. I didn't get a chance to really go into prayer and fasting and what that is. So I just wanted to give you some things from a New Testament perspective on them when it comes to prayer. We've tried to emphasize prayer through the study of the Gospel of Mark, but you can see it in Matthew, you can see it in Luke, and you can see it as John as well. But prayer was a habit of Jesus. I tried to point out numerous times how often the gospel writers go out of the way to tell us that He prayed. And so the same thing that I've said countless times, say it again. If the Son of God Himself made time for prayer and needed prayer, how much more for those of us who are not in that realm? So Jesus had the habit of prayer. We get an example in Mark 1:35 of that, getting up prior to daybreak. Possibly even an insight that He prayed for the cities that He was going to go into, so He prayed. Luke 6:12 through 16, Jesus makes it a point to pray before He selects the 12. We mentioned that prior to that, but a big decision's being made. Obviously, He has all resources, He knows all things, but He still prays prior to a decision. We see Jesus doing that. In Acts 1:24, the 11 pray before Matthias is chosen to take Judas's position. So that says a lot. Again, the disciples, the apostles learn from Jesus. We should be learning the same thing. Prayer needs to be habitual. It needs to be folded into our everyday life. And then Acts 4:23 through 24, when the church experiences her first taste of persecution, what does she do? She prays. So that's something that we're seeing. So with Jesus talking and emphasizing prayer and fasting, there's a lot of examples for that. When it comes to fasting, Jesus had that in His life. Matthew 4:1 through 17, we know commonly as the temptation of Jesus, but He fasted for 40 days. The way that Matthew constructs that is that Jesus used fasting as a preparation for His public ministry. He fasts. He separates Himself from everybody, but He also separates Himself from food. He fasts in preparation for His public ministry. Jesus teaches an expectancy of fasting. In Matthew 6:16 and 18 through 18, when you fast, He's expecting. He uses the same language that He did when you pray, when you give, when you fast. He's almost expecting it to be part of it. Luke 2:37, when Mary and Joseph carried Jesus at 8 days old up to the temple. He meets Simeon, but he also meets Anna, who's a prophetess. What is she doing in the temple every day for decades? She's praying and she is fasting. When Paul, Barnabas go on their first missionary journey, before they leave, the church prays and fasts for their journey. And in Acts 14:23, when elders are being appointed by Paul and traveling companions in the missionary journey, there's fasting prior to elders being chosen and appointed. So fasting and prayer. The one unique thing about fasting as opposed to prayer is that once you get out of the book of Acts, it kind of just disappears. You don't really have a lot of references. I don't know what that would tell. Maybe you could read into that all that you want. But prayer and fasting are very important parts of Old Testament and New Testament. So kind of the discipleship lesson that I wanted to give you last week, just ran out of time to give you. So this is number 23 if you're keeping count. The disciple of Jesus makes the spiritual disciplines a point of emphasis in his or her discipleship. There comes times where we need to fast, where we need to separate ourselves. If you think food, that's fine. If you think television, that's a good idea. Technology, fasting from technology is not a bad idea. There's certain ways, certain things that it looks like. Every fast, I should say this, every fast but one in both Testaments are all voluntary fasts. There's only one commanded fast in the entire Bible, and that is on the one that takes place on the Day of Atonement. So I do want to put that in there. So I'm not saying go do this tomorrow, because Elisha said or the preacher said or whatever. But it is very important. It is folded in. So do what you will with that, but the disciple of Jesus makes the spiritual disciplines a point of emphasis, and we need to do that on that end. So I just wanted to just kind of put a nice little bow on that. We get into this discussion. I want to pick up in verse 33, chapter 9, verse 33. And I had a couple of questions for you last week, and I want to see just if you had a chance to think about them, maybe to study them, to read over some of the text if you had an opportunity. If not, that's okay. We'll discuss here tonight. So we've got Jesus and the 12. They're traveling. They come back to Capernaum. Jesus is trying to stay out of the public eye, and the disciples are having this argument, and it really is an argument. This isn't a back and forth or a tit for tat or anything like that. They are arguing. They are legitimately arguing with one another. So, if you had a chance, and I wanted you to do this, I wanted you to combine Matthew's account, Mark's account, and Luke's account. And my first question to you is, what do we learn from that? Is there anything that we learned from Matthew, Mark, and Luke's accounts combined of this particular episode, of this particular event? Or is there anything that we learn, anything unique from Matthew, Mark, and Luke combined? I know we're looking at Mark specifically, but bringing this in with Matthew's version, Mark's version, and Luke's version, is there anything unique that we learned from this, about this account? Anything that's added to this in any way? Did you notice anything, see anything?
They don't. They're discussing among themselves and they don't ask, but I remember the other two they did.
They did, yes. That is a huge difference. Why do you think that's the case? There's no right or wrong. Why does Matthew and Luke record that the disciples initiate it, and in Mark, Jesus is the one who initiates it? What do y'all think? Never really occurred to you? Any guesses? Anybody want to take a stab at it? It's not a discrepancy. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
He knew that they had been disputing this before he asked them.
Okay.
And so he knew their hearts.
All right. So he does know. So it's not a secret. Just because he's asking the question doesn't mean that he doesn't know and he's truly trying to figure it out. He does know all things, and he knows it's a matter of the heart. So it's in this regard, it just may simply be Matthew's giving an account and then Peter's giving an account, and this is how it is. It could be simple as Jesus says, "What were you discussing?" Well, Jesus, it's funny that you should ask. Who is the greatest? That's what we were discussing. So it could be a question that begets a question and it doesn't have a discrepancy in it. But that's one of the major differences in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The other, and this is just a possibility, who lived in Capernaum? Who had a house in Capernaum? He's an apostle. Peter. And he's married. It's very possible that they're in Peter's house because Jesus could find some quiet time. Just throwing that out as a possibility. And the child that Jesus would use is very possible that this is a son, a daughter, a niece, a nephew, a family member, somebody that is comfortable with Jesus. Throwing all some possibilities in that. It's just unique in some of those details. Matthew gives some of those. So they argue and they're going back and forth and they want to know who is the greatest. And I mentioned to you last week, I thought that this was ironic because this is kind of on the heels of what we would perceive one of their failures. So why is this discussion about who is the greatest, why is it an issue in the first place? Why is this even a problem? Ms. Doris?
Kind of indicates that they're still not getting it.
Okay.
That the whole concept of Jesus leaving heaven, coming to earth, and that he has been doing nothing but serve, is that the greatest is also the greatest servant.
Okay.
And they're just not getting it yet.
Okay, so it could be that they're not, nothing is adding up in terms of this. So the Jesus, his actions, his leaving, the things he's been doing for almost 3 years now, it's just still not adding up, and they're just not getting it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, they still think he is going to establish a kingdom on
Okay.
the earth, and he's the king. And if he's the king, they want to be right up there with him on each side of him because
Okay.
they think that's very important.
Sure, absolutely. So it is still being framed from a physical kingdom. And we know even after the resurrection, they still struggle with this. In Acts 1, 6, and 7, hey, are you going to restore the kingdom? So we know that this was a big issue. And then what Ms. Sharon said, if you're framing it from a worldly point of view, status, position, power, all of those matter. All of those are the most important.
They had a high priest in their religion.
Okay. All right. So even from Judaism, they had an understanding of a high priest. So there was still this understanding of hierarchy. There's this understanding of position. Why else would this be an issue? Why else is this a problem? Tom?
It sows discord. There's no unity in the group then.
Okay, so...
To rule over and make the others serve them because they're the greatest.
Okay.
He's teaching people, and he's not doing that. He's telling them to debase themselves, humble themselves, and serve each other. Okay.
All right, so the fact that whatever's causing the issue, the birth or the repercussions of this is that it's the discord and the lack of harmony, the lack of unity. It's one, in chapter 10, it'll be James and John who come and ask, hey, let us be on your right or left. It just sows this discord, it sows everything, and it undermines the mission to a certain extent. Why else? What else is at play to make this even an issue to begin with? Because go ahead, Adam.
In any organization, like the presidency or kingship, you always have your cabinet beneath you. And there's a ranking of cabinet members. They see Jesus as their leader, as their king. And they have not spelled out any particular positions for each one of them. And so, where am I going to be?
Okay.
Where am I going to be? Remember, they were just from the mountain.
Yes.
And on the mountain was Peter, James, and John. So they already see, okay, what your position is going to be. So there is this underlying current of who's going to be at the top of your position.
Okay. So you're right. Again, looking at the way the societies operate, cabinets, hierarchies, positions, where am I going to be? And how do I get mine? Is kind of the 21st century language. How do I get mine? How do I make sure that I get how do I make sure I'm taken care of? Because a position will do that, prestige will do that, power will do that. Stores?
Not an answer to your question, but just an observation. I think it's interesting that this comes on the heels of them just having realized they didn't have the power
Yes.
to cast out a demon.
Yes, it's the irony of the whole thing that this is the discussion away from where at least they could not cast out a demon where they could have before. So you think you'd already have a little bit of humble pie just because you couldn't do something, but this is it. Think of the emotions that would spur this on: competition, jealousy, envy. I mean, these things are this issue of who's the greatest is born out of something. It's born out of, how do I get mine? It's born out of selfishness. It's born out of Peter thinking, I got to get mine before Matthew does, or if you're Matthew, I got to get mine before Philip does, or if you're Philip, I got to do something before Nathaniel does. So we're competing. There's only so many seats, kind of like what Miss Sharon was mentioning. There's only so many seats, so we got to do what we got, what we can. Problem is, in all of this, is that we're almost 3 years, if not further, into the ministry of Jesus. If there shouldn't be an issue, if this is an issue, if this is a problem, it shouldn't be among the 12. They should have already gotten, as we would say. There's enough, not just verbal teaching, but enough of examples of Jesus taking a lower route. Go ahead, Adam.
In John 6, their question was, we've left everything for you.
Mm-hmm.
What's going to be for us?
Mm-hmm.
So they really have not got it yet.
Right.
They're still struggling with that issue.
It is. Yes, ma'am.
And to go along with that, there's an insecurity, right? I mean, when you don't know your future, you don't know what's going to happen next. Let's say you might be up for a job, but you don't really know. You have that unquiet, that lack of peace, and I think that's where they are right now. They know something's going to happen. Jesus is talking about this stuff, but they don't know if it's literal or figurative or whatever, and they think he's going to be, but they really feel insecure. Mm-hmm. And they want that sense of knowing what's going on.
Yeah. Knowing what's going on, but then that security that goes into the future. Because again, you just told us that you're going to be handed over, killed, and crucified and all of that. Does that mean that's our future too? Or is there another sense of security? So I didn't think about it from a sense of security standpoint, but that makes a lot of sense with a lot of factors. So there's a lot of things that are coming to the table in all of this. Point being, and I've mentioned this to you before, it seems to be the Achilles heel. There will be 2 more instances of this specific thing. Chapter 10, James and John will ask about it. And then finally, when Jesus, what we call instituting communion, in John 13, he stops with a verbal teaching and he gets down on his hands and knees and he washes his feet, as almost to say, I cannot tell you any more than what I've already told you. I'm just going to show you what it looks like. So this becomes an Achilles heel, not just the question of who's the greatest, but the underlying things of this. Insecurity may be an Achilles heel. And some of the things that we have to ask ourselves is why is an issue to begin with in my own life? Why is an argument that's between me and another, why is it an argument to begin with? And what the idea is to move past what is on the surface. Yes, what's on the surface has got to be dealt with. Who's the greatest? That's got to be answered. But what's under the surface of this? Selfishness, jealousy, envy, a sense of security that says, I'm not concerned about someone else's sense of security. I'm concerned about my sense of security. I got to take care of me. I've got to watch out for me. So all of this goes into that.
Am I going to have to make the decisions in the future?
Yes. When it's my turn and making those decisions. So all of this goes, part of us understanding with arguments that take place, whether it's in the home, in the church, or whatever, it isn't just to look at the superficial thing that's there. It's got to be dealt with. But what gave birth to this to begin with? So, Alan.
Well, maybe that's what I'm going to say here. Maybe I'll answer that question. Can you hear me?
Yes. It's okay.
So it's only been, 20-some verses since the 3 were participated in Jesus' transfiguration. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that you know, the others are looking at that and saying, are they special? And they're thinking, of course, that they are special because they saw it.
Yes.
Nobody else, the other 9 were not there. So I really, maybe that had something to do with, maybe that's kind of what he started the conversation where we've got to be the more important ones because look what we were able to participate in. He didn't invite you.
Right. No, I think that's one of the things I was going to mention. I think that's 9 of them are left down in the valley, for the lack of the better way of putting it, and 3 get to go up. And there, as far as we know, the 9 are not privy to what happened on the mountain. Only Peter, James, and John. And even Peter, James, and John are told, don't say anything until after the resurrection. We don't know if they listen, but it's very possible with an attitude. It's very possible that an attitude is of superiority, an attitude of entitlement. The other 9, an attitude of jealousy. You know, there's numerous things, and this is part of where we need to be, is that wisdom needs to be applied on our end to why is something an argument to begin with. Not, again, just the issue, but was it born so many days ago from something? Dennis?
Carol Wallace kind of hinted that they left everything to follow Jesus, and therefore they're entitled to something. And individually, they may be saying, guess what? I gave up more than you gave up. You know, comparing themselves that way. Therefore, they deserve, earn more. Which could unfortunately happen today when people that are very active feel they should have a better reward.
It could very well be. And I didn't think about it in terms of I gave up more. And let's just pretend, for the sake of argument, they're actually in Peter's house. Peter's left home, work, wife, possibly a child. Possibly. What's more, what is Nathaniel left? You know, so there's a way where we compete ourselves with each other. What have you done compared to what I have done? A comparison attitude is one of those. Yes, sir.
I'm a little bit confused because he has told them on the road that he foretells of his death.
Yes.
Then it says that they don't understand.
Yes.
The next thing we come to, they're having a conversation. So what did they understand? Did they not understand his death, or did they understand he was going to die and that someone needed to take his place? You know, so it's kind of. I'm kind of throwing that out because I would like to, if anybody has a comment, to explain that to me. You know, I appreciate it.
The implication is they don't understand the resurrection. Okay, we understand death. We understand death by a cross. We understand burial. After 3 days he will arise is what it says in verse 31, but they did not understand the saying. So the saying refer...
Understand the resurrection, but they did understand that he was going to die.
Yes.
And so then we come to this conversation.
Correct.
Okay, gotcha.
Which, by the way, tells you if the master is focused on death, burial, and resurrection, why are the disciples way out here in a whole other universe focused on the greatest? We're still worlds apart in that time.
I'm just going back to the question. I just wonder if they understood that he was going to die. I don't think they believed it. I mean, look at Peter right before they were ready to fight. He took a sword and cut somebody's ear off. You know, it was like, Lord, they're not going to take you.
Right. Right.
I mean, there's one thing in hearing him say it, but another thing of passing it off like, there ain't no way.
Right.
We've seen him do all these things. There's no way he's going to die. We're not going to let him, first of all. But yeah, how could he?
No, I would, the belief, but even somewhat of the understanding that this would be God's plan. There's still some of that. So don't get me wrong in thinking there's a perfect understanding of all of that. They're still going to have the Holy Spirit explain this in Acts 2 and put everything together through that miraculous indwelling of Him. But they got it. This is the second time you're telling us you're dying. This is the second time you're telling us. But again, the irony, you told us you're dying, but we're going to argue and spend what little time we have left with you about who's the greatest. We're still worlds apart. We're still that way. And that's a big thing for us. With what little time we have left on this earth, and little time may be days, it may be years, I don't know, but just it's a little time. It's a vapor. Why would we spend our time arguing about things that ultimately don't matter. That's a perspective of conflict. Conflict matters because I'm right in it. It's hitting home, and I got to solve it. Yeah, we do. We got to solve it. But it's not as big as Satan is making it out to be. And Jesus is about to give us some lessons on how to handle this. Yes?
You know, they've been together almost 3 years. And in 3 years, no one's had really an official position.
No.
And so we need to iron out what's going to happen after you're gone. I mean, really.
Sure. Yeah.
Who's going to be in charge?
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to run the show?
Yeah.
You tell us this is what we need to do, but who's going to really run the show? You haven't appointed anybody.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one thing that stand out. You have not singled out anybody in the group as being the leader.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is some uncertainty.
There is.
Uncertainty, insecurity. Yeah, I've left my business.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what am I going to do now?
Sure.
Am I going to have the power to do what Jesus has been doing?
Mm-hmm.
Those are questions that's rising in their mind.
They are. And yet the problem is they're arguing with each other. That's how they solve it, is by arguing. How many times do we solve anything by arguing? Well, I just had to get it out. Well, you got it out, now what? You just made somebody else mad. You made them madder. You made them harder to talk to. You made it harder for you to be heard. So what Jesus does is mind-boggling. It's amazing on how he does this. So I left you with this third question. What are some of the things that Jesus says/does that resolves this issue? And I want to just talk about the issue. I know how we're going to deal with that. That's the main point. But there are some secondary points as well. So what are some of the things that he says and or does that puts him on a path away from arguing to a path of peace? What are some of the things he says and or does? Yes, ma'am.
Well, of course, he says to take the focus off themselves
Okay.
and serve others. But I found it really interesting that he doesn't say nobody is going to be first. You think that, like nobody's, he doesn't say that. He says, if you want to be first, put the focus on other people.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So he goes in this route with, he does teach. He answers the question, but not in ways that they think. He answers the question in an upside down way, which reminds us that the nature of the kingdom is completely different than the nature of the world we live in. World, you got to be first. If you're not first, you need to be close to the person who is first. And if you're not close to that person, you need to be close to the person who is close to the person who is first, right? You strategically place yourself. Jesus takes that principle and says the kingdom works that way, but instead of strategically placing yourself first, you intentionally and strategically do what? You place yourself last. You do that. Who is willing to swallow their pride and say, I will be last? I don't care about first. Who is willing to swallow the pride and say, you know what? I'm willing to make this issue a non-issue. Who's willing to do that? Who's willing to swallow their pride and say, you know what? I'm not going to have this. Because there's something more valuable than who's greatest. There's something more valuable than who's first. There's something more valuable than whatever, fill in the blank. And you know what the value is? That 12 are together. Not in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. But they are one unit. But if Philip doesn't swallow his pride and let it go, or if Matthew doesn't swallow his pride and let it go, or if Nathaniel doesn't swallow his pride and let it go, how long is the argument going to continue? We know it continues at least 2 more times. Who's going to swallow it? And what's the object lesson that Jesus provides? And it's 12 and under, by the way. This isn't a 13 or older, it's a 12 and under, yes.
He gave the the object lesson is a cultural lesson. Consider yourself in a family. Who served last? Who has the least authority and power in a household?
Mm-hmm.
The child.
Yep.
So put yourself in that child's position, waiting for the child's turn to eat at the table, okay, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So he disarmed them just there. That was the whole point, to disarm.
The whole point, and here's the thing. So Suzanne, you mentioned that, he didn't answer the question in terms of first in that regard. In that, he does it in a backwards way. Does Jesus get onto them? Does he just lecture them? Does he yell at them? Does he scream at them? Does he go outside and kick rocks? Does he go and slam the door? You know what he does? He turns it into a teaching opportunity. Is he frustrated? Yeah, probably. We've seen him get that way before. One of the ways in which we could handle, and we just know this because others have done it, it's been rare, but it's probably been in our life. What would it look like that the next time the conflict arises, that we, because we've already predetermined we're going to swallow our pride, is that we're not going to let this degrade and de-evolve into a yelling and screaming match and slamming match and lecturing match, and instead, this is going to be a teaching moment. And what does he teach? He doesn't teach about position. He doesn't teach about status. He doesn't teach about power, which he could have done any one of those three, and would he have been right? No. Yeah, he would have been, but he doesn't do any of that. You know what he does? Let's talk about humility. Let's talk about who's willing to swallow whose pride and end this argument. Yes?
This is really more of a question.
Okay.
But not necessarily to anybody, or a thought on how you look at it. But, I started to look at his answer, and it makes me kind of wonder what they were using as their measuring stick.
That's true.
Because if they were doing, if they were doing the things I would have thought he would have expected them to do, which would be, healing, and feeding the hungry, bringing disciples into the group, that those would have been servant type things that they were doing to start with. So what were they, I wonder, measuring to make me the greatest? Is it because I can heal better than you can, or I have some ability to do something different? But it doesn't say, it makes you wonder what they were.
It does.
What they were using as a measuring stick.
Mm-hmm. No, it does, and that's again, we're not privy to why it is. Again, what birthed all of this? Why did this become and spiral out of control among the 12 of them? It's just fascinating that Jesus does go and say, though, if there is a measuring stick, if there is going to be a competition, if you got to argue about something, then let it be humility.
That's not what they were.
Right.
They were arguing about.
Yes. Yes. Go ahead, Justin.
I think it's interesting, too, that when you read all this, nothing in the equation of being a servant in the way that Jesus is talking about it ends up with a pope, right? And so one of these guys is supposedly going to be the pope, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then you think about that, and okay, there's a Vatican, and then you've got all this stuff. Where is the service involved in any of that? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, and I don't like, this is what I was thinking about when you were talking. I don't know why. So, but then I do think, okay, so how does it come to that conclusion when Jesus is talking about serving others, and Jesus later on is going to wash their feet,
yes,
not touch people. I mean, I think to Alan's point, if you could work a miracle, I would think you might start to think you're sort of special, even though it's not you.
Sure.
But talking about washing feet, you don't wash my feet. Mm-hmm. But then, so I don't understand the idea.
No, and that's just where we've always struggled with this. Christendom has always struggled with this. We've just struggled with titles and positions, and we've struggled with this, even within the Scriptures. Elders, deacons, ministers who let things go to their head. It happens. No one's immune to this. That's the other thing that we learn. None of us are immune to this. It's not like we can look at the 12 and chide them and say, they should have known better. We argue about the same things.
Early on, I'm thinking like
Yep.
we look at the early church after the apostles, and then it just starts getting off track, and I think that's where it comes from. They forgot these kind of lessons or whatever, which your human nature starts taking over.
It is, which is, if you ever wanted to do a back to the basics, I know in our mind it's first principles. Humbling yourself like a child is a back to the basic. That's a first principle of the kingdom. Isn't it? Humility is a first principle. Love is a first principle. Looking out for your neighbor is a first principle. Eric, were you raising your hand?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you were just finishing, I guess, it's human nature, I guess, to want structure, and then some people lead, some people follow, but you still want that structure. And you look at where they're coming from. With the Romans, they had Roman law, and then they had Jewish law. There's always somebody in charge, there's always somebody leading, and then Jesus trying to teach them that, yes, like we have elders and deacons, like you said, but their authority comes from God, from Jesus, from God.
Sure.
His power comes from God. And they still serve. They're not, yes, they guide us, but they don't necessarily lay the law on them. I don't know exactly to say it, but they're not ahead of us, I guess.
Yes.
We follow them. Their authority comes from God. And the book and everything, not from just one man says.
Yes.
One man's better, like he was saying. I grew up Catholic too, so I never understood. Like I had questions, and I was told, well, why do we do this? Well, because the priest says, well, why is that? Because the bishop, or because of the pope. Well, I never had a Bible.
Sure.
And I never, I was always, when I grew up, maybe this was the learned mentality, but what I always understood as growing up as Catholic is that basically the priest is the only one with the knowledge to interpret the Bible, and he can understand it, and I can't even understand, so I just have to listen to him, what he says, and do what he says.
Yeah.
And I think he's teaching them, like you said, the whole opposite of human nature is that there is no leader. I'm the leader, and that's it. And everyone else is a servant to everyone else.
Sure. No, it is the opposite of human nature, because from day one it's been about us. And the world does literally move at a cry of a baby. Think about it for a minute. We will literally move heaven and earth once the baby starts crying to figure out what's going on. We will do that. And again, it's care, concern, but from day one, it's been about me. And from day one in the kingdom, it's about someone else. But Elisha has to swallow pride in order for someone else to be elevated. And as long as there is the issue of not swallowing pride and taking the form of a servant, having the attitude of humility, then there will always be issues. There will always be the threat of division. There will always be the threat of arguments and other stuff, Tom.
What he did too is he totally diffused all of the human nature and the physical part of their work. Because they were wondering who was going to be the greatest on this earth and this world to come, whatever they were thinking here and now. And all the reasons behind their argument, whether greed or jealousy or power or whatever it was, when you humble yourself to serve, he just said, my kingdom's not of this world. This is what you do.
Right.
You serve each other. You don't rule over each other. You serve. And then, as the object lesson, he took something innocent and showed this. If you welcome this innocence into your life, you welcome me.
Sure.
And then by welcoming me, you welcome not only me, but God. Because of that innocence, you become innocent. You get rid of all that greed, that power, that hunger for position in this world.
No, you do. And the innocence of the child, and this goes to Adam's point a minute ago, the child is second rate in society. That's what the child is. It's powerless. Who's willing to be powerless? Who's willing to voluntarily say, I will be powerless in this discussion? And I'm framing all of this because look at, if you will, skip over to verse 50 at the very end. And we'll get here and put it all in context. This is the very last verse of the chapter. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its saltiness because you're arguing about who's the greatest, how will you make it salty again? You can't. Have salt in yourselves. And then here's Jesus. Be at peace with one another. That one statement ties all the way back to this argument because they're not at peace with one another. They're losing their saltiness because they're not at peace. How do you get it back? How do you maintain it? Who is willing to voluntarily say, I will take the last position. I will be lower. Who's willing to do that? Go ahead, Beth. I'm sorry.
I was just going to comment that I find it interesting Jesus' body language in a lot of these conflicting situations. When the woman was caught in adultery, Jesus stoops and writes on the ground. Justin mentioned he was washing the disciples' feet. He was, physically made himself lower. And then in the house, he sits down before he addresses them. I don't know if I like it just because I'm physically shorter. It always stood out to me.
No. There was one commentator that I read that Jesus's body language diffused a lot, which was one of the ways, this is one of the things I wanted to point out, I'm glad you did, that one of the things that he did was he knew the position, the actual position he was going to take, and how they were going to see him was going to determine how they heard him. So if you're sitting down as an equal, as opposed to me looking down on you, that's a whole different vibe, a whole different feeling. Stooping down, where she probably was stooped down. She was thrown down. So you're right, the body language is a huge thing, and there's a lot of times where we tower over someone. We kind of tense up a little bit. There's a lot that we learn on how Jesus handles the conflict. Hey, and by the way, in Mark's version, Jesus goes ahead and asks them what the issue is, which is fascinating to me. Because guess what we like to avoid? Conflict. But he asks the question, but he diffuses it because he sits down and says, I heard you. Let's talk about it. He brings a child into his arms. All of these things do a lot. Be aware of your body language. Be aware of who you are. Be aware of the position you take. And here's the biggest thing about this. Does it always work? No. Because in chapter 10, we're going to have this issue all over again. Go ahead, Adam.
I want to ask one thing. You got three brothers, three men go on the mountain, and they see a transformation of Jesus. Yeah, when they come down off that mountain, they're pretty pumped up.
Sure.
And they the 9 fellow disciples who could not remove the demon. So how do you think they feel?
Sure.
Oh, we've been here, we're going to remove that demon.
Yeah.
So there's a competition there.
There's a lot going on, a lot of moving pieces. Who's willing to fuse it? And at the end, I mentioned peace because who is going to put the premium on peace? Jesus does. The next time you find yourself in a conflict, in the congregation, at home, with someone at work, somebody in that conflict has got to put a premium, not on the issue, but on the peace. And the disciple of Jesus pursues an end to conflict by accepting and practicing humility. That's discipleship lesson number 24. We pursue this. I want peace so much that I'm willing to accept and practice humility. So here's just your own little homework. I'm not going to ask it about next week, so whether you do it or not, I hope you do. Look through, starting in the Roman letter, through the rest of the New Testament, with the exception of Revelation. And notice how many times you see humility or some form of humility, some form of the word showing up at the end. Bailey?
I forget who asked, but someone was asking whether it be about understanding they may have captured the earthly sense of what Jesus was saying,
Mhm.
that he might not live very long, and that may be why they started arguing who's going to be greatest, right? He's going to die, he may not be here very long. They may have captured that, but they didn't understand what he was saying.
Sure.
What it was saying is, a child to the father understands that even I may need to be doing some things as a child that the father asked me to do, that that's the humility.
Mhm.
My right is, this isn't fair. I
Sure.
shouldn't have to give my life. I shouldn't have to get treated like this. But I'm going to take the pain or the abuse or the anger that I don't deserve, because that's the right thing to do for the peace, for the reconciliation, to bring people together. That's what I'm going to do as a child of the Father.
Mhm.
That's the kind of children we are. We just do what we need to do, right, as children.
Mhm.
They may not have understood that.
No, and that lesson is still going to come, and we're still learning that lesson ourselves. To accept that it is unfair. Humility says that it's unfair, and that's okay. Humility says that this is not right, but I'm okay with that. I'm at peace with that.
So
Yes, it is. I appreciate you being here tonight.